The shrill sound of metal on tile echoed through the half-empty clubhouse, sending a jolt of alarm through me. I turned away from the table I'd been arranging, its plastic top piled with CPR mannequins, gauze, and sanitized face shields, to see her, the one person in our entire neighborhood who seemed to relish bringing everything to a grinding halt. She marched in, clipboard pressed to her chest like a badge of authority, her precision-cut bob swinging just above the stiff collar of her blouse. One look at her narrowed eyes and tight-lipped scowl told me everything I needed to know. She was about to pull the plug on my carefully planned event. "Shut it down," she declared, voice reverberating off the clubhouse walls. "This is over. I'm canceling it. Right this moment." But we all know that's not the end of the story. Stick with me to see how far she'll go to sabotage a vital community safety class, and how an unexpected stand from off-duty paramedics, and an agreement she never saw coming, turns the tables on her once and for all. I'm Samantha Reynolds, a 28-year-old teacher who recently moved into the Evergreen Grove community, nestled in a cozy suburb of the Pacific Northwest. The name conjures images of tall fir trees, soft rain, and chirping birds, and indeed, for a while, it felt like paradise. I'd found a well-kept house on a peaceful cul-de-sac, complete with green lawns and friendly neighbors who occasionally gathered for potlucks. It was a vision of suburban bliss. I also learned, soon enough, that Evergreen Grove came with its very own homeowners association. I'd heard horror stories about HOAs before, especially about certain board members who derive a twisted sense of purpose from enforcing arcane rules. At first, I dismissed those fears. Ours can't be that bad, I thought. Everyone I met seemed polite, if a bit reserved. Not long into my new residency, I discovered who really held sway over the neighborhood. She introduced herself as Marjorie from the HOA board, but behind her back, nearly everyone called her Karen, not her actual name, but an earned moniker for the way she carried herself and intruded in everyone's business. Karen took it upon herself to monitor the minutiae of life in Evergreen Grove, from measuring the exact height of hedges to sending warnings about mailboxes that didn't meet the official color palette. I tried to stay off her radar. After all, I was new. I mowed my lawn regularly, took in my trash bins punctually, and even double-checked that my backyard fence complied with the recommended paint swatch. For a while, it worked, but I'd always been passionate about community involvement, particularly around education and safety. And that's how my path inevitably crossed Karen's, when I decided to organize an emergency first aid class at the community clubhouse. My sister, Bailey, is an EMT who's been working in emergency services for nearly a decade. Together, we'd often chat about how unprepared most people are for basic medical crises. Choking, cuts, allergic reactions, and even full-blown cardiac arrests. One weekend, over coffee, Bailey mentioned that she and a few of her paramedic friends were willing to teach a free CPR and first aid workshop if I could secure a venue. "Some neighborhoods do these events all the time," she said. "We walk folks through hands-only CPR, wound care, and the basics of what to do before an ambulance arrives. It's a lifesaver, literally." I love the idea. Schools and offices often host such trainings, but neighborhoods rarely do. I figured, why not bring it closer to home? So I checked the Evergreen Grove community guidelines about reserving the clubhouse. The procedure was straightforward. Fill out a form online, describe the event, pay a small deposit. The event had to be open to any resident and comply with noise limits, occupancy, and no alcohol rules. None of that posed a problem. A few days later, I submitted my request, emergency first aid and CPR class, taught by off-duty paramedics. The HOA's administrative assistant, Joyce, responded positively. She asked for a quick phone chat to confirm the details, then approved my reservation for a Saturday morning 3 weeks later. It felt almost too easy. Little did I know, Karen had been on vacation at the time of my request, some exotic beach trip that left the rest of the HOA to function without her watchful eye. Had she been around, I suspect my reservation might never have gone through. As soon as she returned and caught wind of a medical training session in the clubhouse, she set out to sabotage it. Word spread quickly about the class, primarily via the Evergreen Grove Facebook group and some flyers I taped to the community bulletin board. Residents responded enthusiastically. Many had children and wanted to learn how to handle accidents or choking incidents. Others expressed concern about older family members who might suffer a heart attack or a fall. Enthusiasm soared. I received over 40 RSVPs, far more than expected. And then the rumors started. Has the board actually allowed a medical event in the clubhouse? Some residents said Karen was telling people it was inappropriate and against community decorum to discuss graphic injuries or practice mouth-to-mouth resuscitation in a shared space. Others reported that she was making calls to the board, trying to find some clause that would let her shut the class down. At first, I brushed it off as idle gossip. After all, the event was fully approved, deposit paid, and the official schedule posted. But I couldn't shake a growing sense of apprehension. I'd heard about Karen's knack for weaving new rules out of thin air, or for digging up obscure passages in the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and RS, to block anything she personally disliked. A week before the class, I was finalizing the supply list with Bailey. We'd rented a few CPR mannequins, ordered masks, gloves, and gauze. Another paramedic friend, Trevor, had agreed to teach wound care. Everything was on track, until an email from the HOA board's official address popped up in my inbox. The subject line read, "Immediate need to discuss event compliance." My heart sank as I opened it. The message was short. "Dear Ms. Reynolds, we've received concerns regarding the nature of your scheduled emergency first aid and CPR class. We request you attend an urgent review with the HOA board on Monday evening at 6 p.m. to ensure the event aligns with community standards. Failure to comply may result in revocation of clubhouse access. Sincerely, Evergreen Grove HOA." I knew exactly whose concerns these were. The board met in a small conference room adjoining the clubhouse. I arrived 10 minutes early, hoping to demonstrate my willingness to cooperate. Inside, I found Ms. Rosen, the board president, a gentle-looking woman in her 60s who'd always been kind in my interactions with her. Beside her sat two other board members I recognized from social events. And then, at the far end of the table, perched in a seat that seemed 2 sizes too large for her, was Karen. She barely acknowledged my presence as I took a seat in a plastic folding chair. Ms. Rosen cleared her throat, tapping a pen against a stack of papers. "Thank you for coming, Samantha. We just want to clarify a few details about your event." "Of course," I replied calmly. "I'm happy to answer any questions." Karen wasted no time jumping in. "I've reviewed the CC and RS," she said, brandishing a thick binder. "And nowhere does it specifically allow for medical demonstration classes. In fact, we have a strict policy against any type of business or commercial gathering in the clubhouse. We suspect your paramedic friends might be charging a fee." She peered at me over the rim of her reading glasses, as though waiting for me to stumble. I blinked in surprise. "The class is entirely free," I said. "Nobody's making money here." Karen's mouth tightened. "Even so, the idea of demonstrating how to bandage a wound or discussing major trauma in a shared family space is incredibly graphic. Our residents shouldn't be subjected to that if they happen to walk in." I glanced around the table, noticing Ms. Rosen shifting uncomfortably. One of the other board members, Mr. Hamilton, interjected, "It is a private reservation though, right? Only those who signed up would be in attendance." I nodded. "Yes, but it's open to any resident who wants to learn. We'll keep the doors closed. Nobody has to see anything if they don't want to." Karen sniffed. "Then there's the matter of liability. If someone tries out CPR incorrectly and hurts a volunteer, the HOA might be held responsible. Have you considered that, Ms. Reynolds?" I had. Bailey and her colleagues were covered by their own professional liability insurance for teaching classes, and the deposit form included an indemnity clause. I explained all this, handing over copies of the relevant documents. Karen glared at the paperwork, her expression sour. Before she could gather her thoughts for another counterattack, Ms. Rosen spoke up. "Well, Samantha, it appears you've taken steps to cover the liability aspect, and the deposit is paid. As for the graphic content concern, perhaps we can ask that you keep certain demonstrations minimal or discreet. If it's simply CPR and basic first aid." I nodded eagerly. "Of course. We won't be showing any gory images or anything like that. Mostly it's practicing chest compressions on mannequins, learning how to clean and wrap minor wounds, and how to handle choking incidents." Mr. Hamilton leaned forward, looking intrigued. "Honestly, that sounds valuable. If someone in the neighborhood had a heart attack or a child was choking, We'd want as many people trained as possible. Karen pressed her lips together, but Ms. Rosen, sensing the board's mood, gave me a soft smile. All right, well, we'll let the reservation stand. However, she paused, exchanging a glance with Karen. We do ask that you post a sign on the door indicating that a first aid class is in session, so no unsuspecting resident stumbles upon something that makes them uncomfortable. Agreed. Relief washed over me. I nodded. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Karen said nothing, her expression stony. As the meeting wrapped up, Ms. Rosen concluded with, then it's settled. Samantha, best of luck. I think it's a worthwhile event. Despite Ms. Rosen's parting smile, the tension in the room was palpable. I knew Karen wouldn't give up this easily. Over the next few days, I threw myself into final preparations. Bailey confirmed her paramedic colleagues, Trevor, Joe, and Dean, would arrive at 9 a.m. sharp on Saturday, mannequins and medical kits in tow. I typed up a short curriculum outline and sent it to all who'd RSVP'd. Meanwhile, Trevor recommended we provide coffee, water, and a few chairs for older participants who might not stand for long. Thursday evening, I swung by the clubhouse to measure the space and ensure the tables were set up according to plan. Inside, I found that the folding tables we'd requested were missing. Instead, the room was crowded with round banquet tables, awkwardly arranged in a way that left little space for demonstrations on the floor. I tracked down Victor, the clubhouse janitor, who told me he'd never received the request for the rectangular folding tables. Karen said you canceled, he remarked with a shrug. So I didn't set it up as usual. My frustration flared, but I didn't cancel. In fact, the board explicitly let the event go ahead. Did you see any official notice or email about that? He shook his head, looking confused. No, just Karen's word. Let me see if we still have them in storage. We found the folding tables stacked in a locked supply closet. Victor graciously let me in to set them aside, but the entire fiasco wasted precious time. Still, I made sure everything was properly organized for Saturday, storing the chairs at the perimeter, leaving open space in the middle for demonstrations. As I left, I couldn't help but suspect that Karen was behind this little miscommunication. She couldn't override the board's decision outright, so maybe she was resorting to sneaky methods to complicate matters. My suspicions hardened the next evening, when an email blast went out from the HOA address, but only to a portion of the residents. Someone forwarded it to me, outraged. It read, "Attention residents. Please be advised that the Saturday morning event at the clubhouse may involve topics and visual aids of a graphic nature. Parents are strongly cautioned against bringing minors without protective supervision, as content may be disturbing. No official endorsement from the HOA should be implied. Evergreen Grove HOA." I recognized the wording as Karen's. She was trying to scare people off with exaggerated claims about graphic content. By the time I saw the email, the RSVP list had shrunk. Several parents wrote to me expressing second thoughts. Desperate to counter the misinformation, I emailed everyone again, clarifying that the session would be family-friendly and not show any gruesome materials. But damage was done. A chunk of attendees, worried about exposing their kids to something traumatic, decided to bail. I was furious. Bailey tried to calm me. "It's okay, Sam. We'll still teach whoever shows up. Even if we get a smaller turnout, that's still people who can help in an emergency. Don't let her sabotage overshadow the bigger goal." She was right. However many ended up attending, the class would go on. Or so I thought. Saturday morning arrived, crisp and cool, with a thin mist clinging to the edges of the sidewalks. I got to the clubhouse early, armed with fresh coffee and donuts. Bailey and her fellow paramedics arrived shortly after with their large duffel bags and folded mannequins. We were setting up the station, unrolling disposable mats on the floor for practice, when the door burst open. Karen marched in, her hair pinned back more severely than usual, giving her an almost militant appearance. She held a printed letter, which she waved at us, voice ringing with authority. "You can't hold this class today. I'm canceling it." I exchanged a baffled look with Bailey. "What are you talking about? The board already approved it." Karen slammed the letter on a table. "That was before new information came to light. You have participants who might attempt advanced procedures they're not qualified to perform, which puts us at risk of lawsuits. This entire activity violates the no unauthorized medical practice clause in the CC and RS." My mouth went dry. There's no such clause. We're not prescribing or performing any real medical procedures, just teaching first aid. She raised her chin, ignoring Bailey's attempts to speak. I have the authority to shut this down if it poses a liability to the HOA. So pack your things and leave. At that moment, a handful of early arrivals walked in, neighbors who saw the confrontation and paused uncertainly. Karen pointed toward them. Folks, this class is canceled due to liability concerns. Please go home. A ripple of confusion spread among them. Anger flared in my chest. You can't do that, Karen, I said, voice trembling. Ms. Rosen and the board overrode your objections. You don't have unilateral power here. A hint of triumph glinted in Karen's eyes, as though she'd relished waiting for this confrontation. Don't test me, Ms. Reynolds. I can and I will. Now, get out before I call security. This is final. Bailey stepped forward, looking calm but firm. Ma'am, we're just teaching. There's no liability beyond what's covered by our own protections. This is standard procedure for community classes. I've done it dozens of times, with no issues. Karen refused to listen. I suggest you all leave now, or I'll phone the authorities to remove you for trespassing. The HOA does not endorse this event, period. The neighbors who'd come in looked shocked. One older gentleman, Mr. Peters, raised a timid hand. But I had an RSVP. We want this class. Karen cut him off. It's not happening. I expect all of you out of here in the next 5 minutes. She turned on her heel and marched to the door, effectively blocking it, as if she were a guard. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I exchanged an anguished look with Bailey and Trevor. Was this really how it was going to end? Just then, a small group of people arrived from the parking lot. 2 more paramedics who'd come to help teach, and a few additional neighbors. Among them was a tall, broad-shouldered man I recognized. Garrett, an off-duty paramedic who'd grown up in the neighborhood. He wore a polo shirt with a county emblem, and a quiet confidence radiated from him. Morning, he greeted, stepping inside. Seeing Karen glaring at everyone, he paused. Is there a problem? Karen brandished her letter. We're shutting this down. This class is canceled. Liability issues, unapproved content, all of that. Garrett frowned. I'm sorry, who exactly are you to cancel a community safety event? She straightened her posture. I'm on the HOA board, and I have the right to revoke use of the clubhouse for unauthorized events. This is no longer sanctioned. Garrett calmly pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Ma'am, I need to speak with Ms. Rosen or the current board president. Our paramedic union coordinated with your HOA last year for emergency prep classes. There's a written agreement about promoting safety initiatives. I'd like to confirm you can just unilaterally override that. Confusion flickered in Karen's eyes. What agreement? The board is unaware of any such arrangement. Actually, it's from a county-wide initiative, Garrett said, scrolling through his phone. A paramedic liaison group approached local HOAs, offering free workshops on emergency preparedness. Your board, led by Ms. Rosen, signed a statement agreeing to host at least 1 workshop a year. I felt a surge of hope. Could there really be a formal contract? I'd only known about our local arrangement. If there was a broader county-level partnership that might trump Karen's attempts to shut us down. Karen scoffed. I've never seen such a document. If it existed, I would have known. Garrett shrugged. I have a copy on file. It has Ms. Rosen's signature, along with the official stamp from the county paramedic coordinator. Let me just call them to confirm. He stepped out of earshot, phone pressed to his ear. Karen's cheeks flushed, her grip tightening on her letter. She sputtered. Well, we can't be expected to abide by something that isn't valid anymore. Perhaps that contract expired. But the seed of doubt was there, visible in her eyes. Meanwhile, neighbors were gathering behind us, quietly rebelling against Karen's attempts to bar them from the clubhouse. My paramedic friends, Trevor, Joe, Dean, and Bailey, exchanged glances as though poised to stand firm until we got clarity. After a tense few minutes, Garrett returned. Ms. Rosen is on her way. She's not far. Also, the county coordinator confirmed the agreement with your HOA remains in effect for 2 full years. It includes provisions for CPR and first aid sessions specifically. So unless Ms. Rosen personally orders us out, I believe we have a green light. Karen's jaw tightened. She looked around at the small crowd, realizing she might be outnumbered. For a brief moment, it seemed she'd argue again, but then Ms. Rosen herself arrived, a little out of breath. What's all this fuss? Ms. Rosen asked. eyes darting between Karen and the paramedics. I got a call from Garrett about an emergency first aid class being canceled. Karen attempted to maintain composure. There are liability and content concerns, Janine. This could put us at risk or traumatize children. Ms. Rosen cut her off with a wave of her hand. Karen, calm down. We discussed this. The board approved the event, and we do have that agreement with the county. You know that. It was in the minutes from last year. Karen blanched. I must have overlooked. Ms. Rosen turned to me, an apologetic look on her face. Samantha, I'm sorry for this confusion. You and your paramedic team absolutely have permission to use the clubhouse. As long as you follow the guidelines we discussed, there's no reason to cancel. I appreciate you all making the time to teach this. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to speak with Karen. With that, Ms. Rosen pulled Karen aside, leading her out of earshot. The rest of us stood in awkward silence, hearing muffled voices. Karen's stance was rigid, Ms. Rosen's gestures calm but firm. Finally, Ms. Rosen returned alone, clearing her throat. Please proceed with your class, she announced to the group. Karen has decided to leave for now. Without another word, Karen marched to the door, pushing past a few bystanders. She paused just long enough to shoot me a glare that could curdle milk, then disappeared into the hallway. I exhaled a shaky breath, relief washing through me. It wasn't a warm and fuzzy victory, but the paramedics' knowledge of the official agreement had saved us from abrupt cancellation. Ms. Rosen offered a tight-lipped smile. My apologies. Let's get you all set up properly. Chapter 8. The class begins, under watchful eyes. We rearranged the clubhouse with Ms. Rosen's help, ensuring we had enough space for the CPR mannequins and a table for bandaging demos. My sister, Bailey, double-checked that the water cooler was stocked and the windows were slightly cracked to let in fresh air. One by one, participants trickled in, some looking concerned after the earlier confrontation. I assured them everything was fine. The class was definitely happening. Despite Karen's attempts to scare people off, we still had about 20 participants. A handful admitted they'd almost stayed home after reading the graphic content warning email. But curiosity and the desire to learn triumphed. A few parents even brought older children, with consent forms, in case we tried out real compressions on the mannequins. As I welcomed everyone, Bailey introduced the paramedic team. I'm Bailey, an EMT with the county. This is Trevor, Joe, Dean, and Garrett, some of the finest paramedics you'll ever meet. The group gave friendly waves. Trevor started the session with a lively introduction about why first aid matters. Sometimes, the difference between life and death is knowing how to respond in the first few minutes. It could be your spouse, your neighbor, or even a stranger in the grocery store. We're going to show you how to keep them stable until professional help arrives. Joe took over next, leading the group in a basic CPR demonstration. She placed a mannequin on the floor, explaining step by step. Check responsiveness, call 911, position hands, start compressions. She cracked jokes here and there to lighten the mood, but also emphasized the seriousness of these skills. Participants knelt in pairs, practicing the motions on mannequins, learning to keep the beat at roughly 100 to 120 compressions per minute. Meanwhile, Bailey and Trevor moved among the participants, offering hands-on corrections. Straighten your arms, don't press too hard, keep that tempo. For the older kids present, they gave simplified instructions, helping them see it as an empowering skill rather than something frightening. Halfway through, we paused for a break, encouraging everyone to hydrate and stretch. I grabbed a coffee and scanned the room. The tension from the morning's confrontation had mostly dissolved. People were smiling, sharing stories of close calls or times they'd felt helpless in emergencies. It was exactly the sense of community and preparedness I dreamed of fostering. However, I spotted Ms. Rosen by the door, talking to someone in a low voice. My heart skipped a beat. Could it be Karen again? But no, it was Mr. Hamilton, another board member. They seemed to be in a serious discussion, occasionally glancing in my direction. I felt a flicker of worry. Could new issues be cropping up? I let it go for the moment, focusing on the class. After break, Dean and Garrett led the wound care section, demonstrating how to clean cuts, apply pressure, and bandage effectively. They showed everyone how to handle simple household injuries like burns or lacerations, plus the correct steps for dealing with a severe bleed while waiting for paramedics. Any illusions of graphic content were dispelled by the calm, practical approach. The paramedics used only sanitized demonstration props. No gore, no shocking visuals. Children and adults alike listened intently, some taking notes on their phones. By the end, we'd covered choking procedures and basic instructions for handling allergic reactions with epinephrine auto-injectors. The neighbors practiced how to reassure a victim, keep them warm, and gather key information for the arriving ambulance. The class concluded with a short Q&A, where folks asked about real-life scenarios. Finally, we thanked the paramedics with an enthusiastic round of applause. They reminded everyone to keep practicing these skills and to consider advanced courses or official CPR certification from local community centers. Despite Karen's sabotage attempts, the event felt like a success. But as the last participants filtered out, Ms. Rosen approached me with a worried frown. "Samantha, could we talk?" she asked quietly. My stomach flipped. "Sure. Everything okay?" She hesitated. "Karen's filed a formal complaint with the board against you. We need to sort it out, preferably soon." I followed Ms. Rosen into a small side office just off the clubhouse's main hall. The walls were adorned with pictures of past community gatherings, Easter egg hunts, holiday parties, summer barbecues. Each snapshot radiated a sense of fun and belonging, a stark contrast to the dread churning inside me. Ms. Rosen took a seat behind a modest desk stacked with HOA paperwork and a small laptop. She gestured for me to sit in the chair opposite. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat. "What's the complaint about?" I asked, though I had an inkling. Karen never gave up easily. Ms. Rosen rubbed her temples. "She's claiming that you used the clubhouse for an unauthorized commercial event because she believes you might have collected money or donations from participants. She also says you allowed minors without parental supervision to practice medical procedures, which allegedly violates something or other in the bylaws." My jaw dropped. "That's ludicrous. I collected zero fees. Parents were present. I have emails and sign-up sheets that show it was a volunteer-based event. No money exchanged." Ms. Rosen nodded. "I figured as much. Also, Karen's complaining about how you left the clubhouse in disarray with the tables and supplies. Victor told me everything was put back properly, so that part likely won't stick." I sighed. She's grasping at straws because she lost the battle this morning. But can the board do anything about this complaint? Ms. Rosen pursed her lips. "We'll have to review it at our next board meeting, possibly an executive session if she demands it. But I assure you, the majority of us have no interest in punishing you for hosting a beneficial class. Karen stands alone in her vendetta, though she does have one or two allies who might cause trouble." I brushed a stray hair behind my ear, trying to calm my racing thoughts. "Okay. Let me know what you need from me, any documentation, statements, whatever." She smiled sympathetically. "Thank you. I appreciate your cooperation. I just wanted to warn you so you're not blindsided. I'll do my best to keep this from escalating further." I thanked her and left the office. As I stepped back into the main area, the paramedics were packing up. Bailey gave me a questioning look, and I filled her in on Karen's new complaint. My sister's lips formed a grim line. "That woman is out for blood." Trevor, overhearing, shook his head. "She's a piece of work. Don't let her get to you, Sam. What's she going to do, fine you for saving lives?" I tried to laugh it off, but anxiety simmered in my belly. Knowing Karen, she might drum up new violations and file them systematically until I caved. The class was a success, but the aftermath felt uncertain. Over the following week, the neighborhood chatter turned intense. Word spread quickly about the showdown at the clubhouse the moment Karen tried to cancel a first aid class, only for paramedics to sign a county-level agreement. People who hadn't even attended the event chimed in on the community's online forum, praising the paramedics and condemning Karen's behavior. A few defended Karen, claiming she was just being cautious about liability or that the class belonged in a hospital setting, not a family neighborhood. But they were a minority. Most comments were scathing, portraying Karen as overbearing and self-appointed queen of the HOA. A small but vocal group started discussing the possibility of recalling her from the board. "She's gone too far," one neighbor wrote. "What if next time she cancels a kid's swim lesson or a senior safety workshop? She's abusing her power." Another suggested launching a petition. Meanwhile, Ms. Rosen scheduled a special board meeting to address the fallout from Karen's complaint. The agenda indicated a few confidential items, which I assumed included the complaint against me. Nervous but resolute, I gathered all my proof emails, sign-up sheets, indemnity forms, even the official county paramedic agreement that Garrett had referenced. On Thursday evening, I arrived at the community center early. The parking lot was packed, far more cars than usual for a routine HOA board meeting. Stepping inside, I realized a crowd of residents had shown up. Some wore expressions of indignation, others simply looked curious. Karen was nowhere in sight, at least not yet. Ms. Rosen welcomed people with forced cheer. We have a full house tonight. Once we handle some quick housekeeping items on the agenda, we'll open the floor for discussion on the emergency class situation and any related concerns. I spotted Tiana, a neighbor who'd been vocally supportive on the online forum. She waved me over, offering a seat next to her. Don't worry, she whispered. The neighborhood's on your side. Across the aisle sat Mr. and Mrs. Holland, who had left the class early because their young daughter felt intimidated by the confrontation. They smiled kindly at me. Indeed, the atmosphere felt like a community rallying to challenge Karen's strong-arm tactics. At 7 p.m. sharp, Ms. Rosen officially started the meeting. The board members, Karen included, took their seats behind a long table at the front of the room. Karen looked uncharacteristically pale, though her expression remained pinched. She avoided eye contact with me. Mr. Hamilton began by running through standard business, budget updates, landscaping news, and upcoming holiday potluck. Tension built in the air as we reached the final topic. Item 6. Discussion of the paramedic, first aid class and related complaint. Ms. Rosen cleared her throat. We'll begin with a summary. Samantha Reynolds organized a first aid and CPR class in cooperation with county paramedics. It was free, deposit paid, and aligns with the county's agreement for community safety outreach. On the day of the event, certain issues arose concerning an attempted cancellation. Karen has also lodged a formal complaint regarding Ms. Reynolds' use of the clubhouse. Now we'll open the floor for statements. Karen immediately leaned into her microphone. Thank you, Ms. Rosen. First, I'd like to clarify that my intent was never to harm the community, but to protect it. We have liability concerns. We can't just let anyone practice medical techniques in our shared space. What if a child performed CPR incorrectly and hurt another child? Who pays the lawsuit? Someone in the audience muttered, "That's ridiculous," sparking a low rumble of agreement. Karen pressed on. Furthermore, I had evidence Ms. Reynolds might be collecting donations like a hidden fee. That's effectively turning a private amenity into a commercial enterprise. She pointed a manicured finger at me. I request that Ms. Reynolds prove she wasn't profiting from this, and that we consider imposing a fine if she can't provide adequate evidence. Gasps sounded around the room. Ms. Rosen placed a hand on her temple, looking exasperated. Let's hear from Ms. Reynolds next. I stood, nerves thrumming. I have copies of all email invites, sign-up sheets, and communications with the paramedics. No money was involved. The class was a free educational session. As for liability, we had coverage through the Paramedics Union. And may I remind everyone of the county agreement that specifically endorses community-based safety training? Ms. Rosen, I've sent you that document. Perhaps you can confirm it. Ms. Rosen nodded. Yes, it's valid. I have it here. She waved a printed copy. Before Karen could respond, Tiana jumped up. My kids attended the class. It was well supervised, entirely voluntary, and no fees were collected. Karen's making false accusations. A chorus of voices from the audience chimed in, many praising the class and denouncing Karen's sabotage. Ms. Rosen banged the gavel lightly to maintain order. Please, one at a time. After a few more neighbors spoke, Mr. Hamilton addressed Karen. Where's your evidence of commercial activity, Karen? Any written statements or receipts? Karen fumbled with her binder, color rising in her cheeks. I have screenshots of a conversation on the forum where someone mentioned a donation jar might be out. I blinked in confusion. Donation jar? We had a coffee can for Paramedics Coffee Fund, but it was optional. No one was forced or even asked to contribute, and I personally never touched a cent. Karen's gaze flicked around. But it sets a precedent. People might think they have to pay. It's effectively a fee. Ms. Rosen held up a hand. Karen, that's stretching. Unless Ms. Reynolds demanded money for admission, it's not a commercial event. If you have no more concrete proof, we can't pursue a violation on that basis. Karen glowered, shoulders slumping slightly. She tried one more angle. Well, then there's the issue of children being exposed to graphic imagery. I have statements from 2 parents. Mr. and Mrs. Holland raised their hands. Our daughter attended. There was nothing graphic. She left early only because she was nervous after that confrontation, not because the class was inappropriate. Karen's face fell, as though her last hope had been dashed. A hush settled in the room. Ms. Rosen looked at the other board members. Any further questions? They shook their heads. She turned to the audience. Would anyone else like to comment? Garrett, the off-duty paramedic, stood. Just to reiterate, I helped coordinate this with Ms. Rosen last year. The entire point is to empower residents to handle emergencies responsibly. If Ms. Reynolds is penalized for doing exactly what the county recommended, that sends a terrible message. We paramedics do this out of a desire to help. Let's not stifle that with petty politics. Applause erupted. Karen sat stiff, arms crossed, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. After a moment, Ms. Rosen took a breath. All right, we'll hold a board vote on the complaint. Those in favor of upholding Karen's complaint and imposing a penalty on Ms. Reynolds, raise your hand. I held my breath. Karen raised her hand immediately, face flushed. The board member next to her hesitated, then kept his hand down. Mr. Hamilton stayed still. Ms. Rosen obviously opposed, and the final board member shook her head. That was 1 out of 5 in favor. Karen visibly deflated as Ms. Rosen announced, the complaint is dismissed. No penalty or further action. Additionally, we reaffirmed that community safety classes are permitted under the existing county agreement, so long as they adhere to standard reservation rules. The matter is resolved. A wave of relief and excitement surged through the audience, many applauding or patting me on the back. I smiled broadly, hugging Tiana and sharing victorious nods with the paramedics. Up front, Karen looked humiliated. She began gathering her binder and papers with shaky hands. But the room's mood quickly shifted as Ms. Rosen tapped her microphone again. Before we conclude, there's one more petition on the agenda, a request from at least 25 residents to discuss an early recall vote for Karen's position on the board, citing repeated misuse of authority. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Karen froze mid-motion. I, too, stared in astonishment. I'd heard rumors about a recall, but I never imagined it would appear so soon and so publicly. Ms. Rosen continued. According to the bylaws, if enough residents formally request a special election, the board must schedule one. The petition meets that threshold, so we need to set a date to allow Karen to address the concerns and for the community to vote. The tension in the air was electric. Karen's eyes widened, flicking between Ms. Rosen and the audience. She forced a laugh that sounded more like a choke. Surely we don't need to go that far. This is all because I wanted to keep our community safe and decent. A man in the front row spoke up. Safe? Decent? You tried to shut down a first aid class that could save a life. You threatened people for no good reason. That's not what we want in an HOA board member. A murmur of agreement swept the room. Even those who hadn't signed the petition seemed swayed by the fiasco. Karen's voice trembled. I was acting in good faith. I had legitimate concerns. I never meant to it. Ms. Rosen stepped in gently. You'll have an opportunity to speak at the special election meeting, Karen. We're simply fulfilling protocol tonight by scheduling it. Let's set it for 3 weeks from now. Karen nodded stiffly, her face pale. She appeared poised to say something, but then snapped her binder shut and stood. In a quavering voice, she announced, Fine. I see how it is. I'll defend my record at the proper time. Good evening. Without waiting for further remarks, she stalked out of the room, leaving behind a swirl of whispers and tense excitement. Ms. Rosen banged the gavel softly. Meeting adjourned. Thank you all for coming. As the crowd dispersed, several neighbors approached me with congratulations or gratitude. Some expressed relief that the class fiasco had sparked a deeper conversation about Karen's power grabs. Others worried that a recall campaign would be divisive. But the prevailing sentiment was that the community was fed up with being bullied. In the days following that dramatic board meeting, the neighborhood buzzed with talk of the upcoming recall vote. Petitions circulated widely. My phone lit up with messages from people I barely knew, thanking me or asking questions about Karen's behavior. It felt surreal, like I'd inadvertently become a catalyst for a broader movement. Meanwhile, the paramedics posted photos from the first aid class on their official social media page. They praised Evergreen Grove's community spirit and promised to hold more sessions if invited. People in the surrounding area took notice. A few neighboring HOAs even inquired about hosting their own safety workshops. It was a far-reaching ripple effect, ironically fueled by Karen's attempt at cancellation. On a personal level, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety. No one wants to be the center of an HOA political storm, especially not in their own neighborhood. But the overwhelming support reminded me that standing up for what's right often unites people who were silently waiting for change. When the recall vote finally happened, a surprisingly high percentage of residents turned out, either in person at the community center or via absentee ballots. The atmosphere was tense but civil. Karen made a last-ditch effort, claiming she was a watchdog protecting property values and moral standards. Yet, the stories of her harassment, meddling, and overreach were fresh in everyone's minds. The result? An unequivocal outcome. 73% voted to remove Karen from the board. Amid hushed whispers and a few gasps, Ms. Rosen announced the result, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. Karen stood at the back of the room, face drained of color. She slipped out quietly, ignoring attempts by a couple of her allies to console her. Just like that, her reign on the HOA board ended. In the aftermath, Ms. Rosen and the remaining members pledged to adopt clearer guidelines for community events, ensuring that no single board member could unilaterally shut down approved activities. They even formed a neighborhood wellness committee, inviting volunteers, including me, to organize events like first aid workshops, fire safety talks, and other preparedness programs. For my part, I realized that confrontation, while stressful, can be a necessary path to improving community life. Because of Karen's actions, we'd ended up shining a light on outdated rules, clarifying liability issues, and reaffirming our partnership with local paramedics. Yes, it was rocky, but the outcome made Evergreen Grove stronger. One sunny Saturday afternoon, about a month after the recall, I walked past the clubhouse and saw a group of teenagers practicing CPR on mannequins under Bailey's supervision. Parents looked on, smiling. In the corner, Ms. Rosen greeted newcomers, handing them pamphlets about preventing house fires. I felt a wave of pride. Our little corner of the world was safer, more welcoming, and free from petty tyranny. Karen still lived in Evergreen Grove, of course. Occasionally, I'd see her pulling weeds in her yard, or driving past with that same rigid posture. But her days of terrorizing the neighborhood with bureaucratic zeal were over. The majority had spoken, and if she ever tried to meddle again, we now had the guidelines and resolve to stand firm. Listen closely. Sometimes, the battle to preserve what's good in a community demands confronting those who twist the rules for control. Though the road can be fraught with conflict and uncertainty, in the end, perseverance and unity can triumph, leaving the neighborhood stronger, safer, and more connected than ever before.